Hi everybody, it's Krish Kandai here, and you are joining me. I've got a slightly new setup. Let me know if you think it works better or worse than the previous one. But I'm just experimenting to see how we might be live and useful to anyone that would like to watch. I'm just going to check we have gone live because yesterday I had a little bit of an issue with the Facebook page. So we've been doing a little series looking at people in the Bible who I guess are experiencing social isolation, people that are struggling to find somewhere where they belong, and how God meets them in that moment. So the first day we looked at Noah and God locking him into the ark and how he coped with that form of social isolation. Then we looked at Abraham and Sarah, and them having to leave their family, their security, and go live in a strange new place. And yesterday we looked at Hagar, a really difficult story of sexual exploitation and some like the original version of The Handmaid's Tale and how that worked out. And today we're looking at the story of Jacob. And maybe you know the story of Jacob really well. If you don't know the Bible brilliantly, maybe the closest reference you've got is Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. Jacob is the dad. Do you remember the song Jacob, Jacob and Sons? And then you get listed all the descendants that he had. Well, we're going to talk about Jacob's origin story today. What happened to him and how he met God in his loneliness. As part of the new pattern of life, our family are able to have all our meals together, which is lovely. So we have breakfast together, lunch together, and at dinner I give a run through. We kind of talk about the story that we're going to be exploring in our time together online. And we had some visitors over tonight, some twins, ironically, which is what the story is going to be about. And one of the twins could remember with almost amazing detail the story of Jacob. It really resonated with him. My twin neighbour is 9 years old, and he could recount all the details of this story, putting me and my wife to shame. And there's something quite powerful, isn't there, about these Bible stories. As we work through, depending on how long our lock-in is going to be, we'll end up getting to the New Testament and how faith in isolation works out there. But there is something really powerful about teaching these stories to a rising generation, sharing them with our children, allowing people to kind of get their heads inside the story, because stories are abductive. They steal your focus and imagination and your attention, and they make your brain whir and wrestle, and they get under your skin. So I'm hoping these stories will get under your skin, but in a helpful way that might be able to sustain you as you're going through maybe difficult times. So this story of Jacob, if you want to follow along in the Bible, I'm going to pick it up probably around Genesis 28 verse 10. But you probably know the story. Jacob and Esau are twins. Esau is the older twin, and when he came out of the womb, his brother Jacob was grasping his heel. And it's one of the kind of all-time great stories of sibling rivalry that right through their life, even from the very beginning, there was this animosity between the two. Esau was hairy, Jacob was smooth. Esau liked to go and kill things. Jacob was more of a kind of homebody that liked cooking. Esau didn't really seem to value his inheritance, because as the older son, even though he was only a couple of minutes older, he would get a double portion of any inheritance. And he was willing to sell it to his brother when he was really hungry, coming back from a hunt, just for some warm soup that Jacob had prepared. And then there was this amazing kind of first identity theft in history when Jacob tricked his father, with the help of his mother, into giving him the double inheritance, the blessing. And it's something that Isaac, his father, should have given him, should have given his older brother Esau, but because he was partially sighted, the mother tricked him. They cooked a nice broth up and then put some animal skins on him, so that when Isaac reached out to Jacob's smooth arm, he came across this kind of hairy skin, and he got the blessing. And then he had to go on the run. That's where this passage picks up. Jacob is on the run. His brother Esau is trying to track him down and kill him. And so he goes on the run, and he gets exhausted, and he doesn't even have anywhere to find shelter. And that's when this story kicks in. and it's from Genesis chapter 28, verse 10, if you want to follow along. Jacob left Beersheba. Just a little note, Beersheba is where we left the story yesterday when we were looking at the story of Hagar. So that's just by the by. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. This is telling you he had no hospitality. No one looked after him. He was far away from everywhere. He probably felt as lonely as he can get. This is faith meeting someone in the wasteland. That's where we are. Even no comforting pillow under his head, just a stone for a pillow. And there Jacob had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord of God, your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the east and to the west, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised. Now, just imagine you're Jacob, right? You've blown it. You've messed things up with your brother. He's coming down to kill you. You've got nowhere to live, nowhere to sleep, just putting a rock underneath your head. You probably felt as lonely and as isolated as it's possible to get. And yet it's there that God comes to meet you. And God comes to meet you in a strange dream. And I don't know, if you're a rock music fan, you're probably hearing A Stairway to Heaven. That sounds a bit like Led Zeppelin. Well, maybe that was Led Zeppelin's inspiration. I've only really listened to the guitar solos and can't remember the lyrics. But what's going on here? Why is there a kind of stairway or an elevator or a ladder between heaven and earth right there in the middle of the wasteland? What's being communicated? I think the best I can think is it's like two worlds colliding. It's like, I don't know, my daughter's really into Harry Potter. It's like that platform, 9 3/4 of King's Cross Station. It's the gateway between two spaces. It's like Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. The wardrobe is a thin space where heaven and earth, or Narnia and earth, intercede. And God is kind of just telling Jacob that he's not far away. That God is not some distant deity that has forgotten about him, but God is present, God is close. It's like our reality has been stripped apart so that we can see that we are close to God. And that's a complicated idea, isn't it? Because for many people, they struggle with the reality of God because they can't see him. And it reminds me of people walking around Oxford. You know, I teach very occasionally at one of the Oxford colleges, Regent's Park College. And when I'm in Oxford, I love it. It's such a beautiful place. But American tourists, they're not always Americans, but a lot of American tourists will come up to you and they say, where is the university? I think they're expecting a campus somewhere. But actually, the Oxford University are lots of colleges that are spread around Oxford. So I like to tell them, well, the university's all around you. You know, you're in its presence, even if you don't recognise it. And that's a little bit like God, isn't it? That he is all around us. He's omnipresent. And yet often we don't realise him, we don't sense him. And sometimes that's about the pace of life. We're zipping around and we don't take time to see God and recognise him and pause and listen to him. But for here, Jacob is as far away as he can be. He's as down as he can be. And he's not even got a pillow under his head. And God wants to say, I am with you. In me you live and move and have your being, as it says later in the New Testament. Jacob needs to know that heaven and earth collide and God can be trusted and experienced wherever you are. Maybe you need to know that tonight. Maybe this social isolation is getting under your skin. Maybe you're alone and you're thinking there is no one here for me. Well, Jacob's dream would be true for you. Heaven and earth are intersecting right here. And when we pray and when we still ourselves and we seek God, that we can come to know his presence. Maybe we won't get a vision, but we get a promise here that God is near. Now, the next part of the Jacob story, you know, this is an intersection in his life. He's left his home and his family. He's on the run from everybody. and God meets him there. But he's on his way to visit his father-in-law, I think, Laban. And, well, he becomes his father-in-law. It's one of his mother's relatives. And Laban is a very savvy guy, and he realizes that he has two daughters, and Rachel is the beautiful daughter, and Jacob falls madly in love with her and asks Laban what he needs to do in order to win her hand. And Laban says, well, work for me for 7 years and then you can marry my daughter. And it's a beautifully romantic story because Jacob's willing to do it, right? Jacob, the chancer who's willing to steal and deceive, is willing to work for 7 years in order to get the hand of Rachel. And he has this massive wedding feast, and everyone has a little bit too much to drink. And Jacob wakes up the next morning, turns to his wife, and you kind of want to see the look on his face because he realizes that the wife he thought he married is not the person lying next to him in bed. He has married Leah, the older sister. There's not a brilliantly encouraging description of Leah. The only thing you're told about her is that she had a weak eye. So she's the older sister. By right, she should be married first. But that wasn't the person that Jacob thought he was going to marry. And it's such beautiful poetic justice because Jacob the deceiver is deceived. Jacob, the one who was involved in identity theft, has the same trick played on him. So it's brilliant. It's lovely, except for Jacob. So he goes to Laban, has it out with him, and Laban says, no, work for me for another 7 years, then you can marry Rachel. And you think, oh my goodness, quit while you're ahead. But no, Jacob is just the ultimate romantic. Married the wrong woman, 7 more years, 14 years in total he has to work in order to win the hand of Rachel, and then she's his. And they get married. It's complicated about polygamy in those days. Let's not go there, or ask me a question about it. I'm open. And then they start having babies, both of them, and they have a kind of they weaponize their babies because each baby's given a different name that is a dig at the other wife or all their circumstances. And they have all these children, and this is how the tribes of Israel come to be. And then Jacob has to leave, and so he manages to do another swindle on Laban, who swindled him, and he takes all the best livestock. And he wants to go home. And he wants to go and kind of make up with his brother, even though it's been, at least 14 years on the run. And but he's nervous because Esau's strong and powerful. And so he realises he's going to have to come face to face with him. And he sends his wives off in 2 different directions on the journey home so that if Esau were to attack, he wouldn't lose all his family in one go, a bit like the royal family, not travelling all together. And then he finds himself alone again in the middle of the night in a river. And in the middle of this river, a stranger comes up to him and begins to wrestle him. And we know from the Bible story that this stranger wrestling with Jacob is God. But at the beginning of the story anyway, Jacob hasn't worked this out. So here it is in chapter 32, verse 22. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford to Jabbok. After he'd sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Full disclosure, right? I am cribbing all of these ideas off of a book, but I think it's okay because the book is a book I wrote called. Oh, is that going to work? How are we going to do? Oh, it's following my face. You can't see that. If I put it in front of my face, maybe that would. It's called God is Stranger, and in it I track all the different places where God turns up unannounced, uninvited, And this Jacob story is kind of a key story in this book. So it's available from all bookshops, which are now closed, I think. But you can buy it on Kindle, or other e-formats are also available. And this story is just so full of meaning. And if we see that God met Jacob in the wasteland, Jacob found faith in the wasteland. Now God meets Jacob in the wrestling. You find faith in the wrestling. Why does God wrestle with Jacob? Why does he come in this kind of undercover way? Why doesn't he just reveal who he is fully to him? Why does he come in this kind of incognito, in disguise way? I think God wants to get up close and personal with Jacob, and he's such a self-made man that this is the best way that God could get close. And this wrestling reminds me of when my kids were small. I've got 6 kids. I run a fostering and adoption charity called Home for Good. We have 3 birth kids and 3 fostered and adopted children. And when they're young, it's not unusual on the kind of little rug in our lounge for me to wrestle with the children. And when it might just be before bedtime, and I'll pretend that they're strong enough to beat me, or to pin me down on the ground. And I'm holding back all my strength, aren't I, in order that I might be close with my children, that we might have fun together, that this might be a bonding time, and they might feel some sort of power in this time. And I think that's what God's doing. God is withholding all his strength. There is no way. God can just destroy the universe with just a fingerprint. God, it says in Psalm 68, his enemies melt before him like wax. God is not overpowered or overcome by Jacob. He allows Jacob to think he's got this kind of victory going on. And in this wrestling, Jacob comes to a new level of understanding, a new relationship with God. And I think that's not a bad way of imagining what I guess we're trying to do here. We're trying to wrestle with a bit of the Bible, wrestle with difficult to understand ideas about God. We're trying to do that to get close to him. And actually that's okay. That's allowed. If you read the Psalms, for example, people are often wrestling out loud with God. They don't understand why God is behaving the way he is. And so God allows us to wrestle with him physically, spiritually, mentally and intellectually. And maybe that's you right now. You're going through a kind of wrestling experience with God. You can't quite understand what's happening. Why is he allowing people that you love to come into danger? Why many people around the world are kind of wrestling with financial bankruptcy, or just this social isolation. And I would say from this story and from the Psalms, a really good way of kind of working that out is to wrestle with God, maybe in prayer. Maybe just speak out to God the stuff that you're struggling with. Maybe say to him that I don't understand why you're doing this. Why is my family in this dangerous situation? Where are you? That kind of openness and frankness with God is actually really good for us. And to be honest, I struggle with that sometimes. Sometimes I'm better at kind of having it out with God, and sometimes I just internalize it. But I know when I have had it out with God, when I have struggled with him out loud, that's brought me closer to him. And maybe you're an introvert and talking out loud to God is going to be hard. I think you could do it by journaling, or whatever method you're going to get those questions or doubts or issues out there. I'd recommend you to do it. But the third bit, I guess the hardest bit to work out, if we find faith in the wasteland, God meets us in our low points. We find faith in the wrestling. The third point is we find God in our wounding. It's strange, isn't it? God allows Jacob to think he's won, but he just touches his leg, and Jacob is like permanently crippled as a result. And it was such an important part of Jacob's identity when he got a new name after this wrestling incident. He became Israel. The Israelites, the Jewish people, wouldn't eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because that would be wrong. That would somehow not honour the memory of this incident with Jacob. And you think, well, God, why would you do that? You're play fighting with Jacob in order to get close to him, but why would you wound him? Why would that be the means by which you draw close? It's It's crazy, isn't it? And I guess the best way I can understand that, and it's from an incredible story written by C.S. Lewis called The Horse and His Boy. And it tells the story of a young lad who finds out that he's going to be trafficked. He was an orphan boy, and he finds out that the people that had been caring for him are going to sell him, right? And so he tries to run away, and he manages to run away with a horse, and it's a talking horse. I know, it's a crazy fable and parable. If you've not read the Narnia Chronicles by C.S. Lewis, please do. Great thing to read with your children if you haven't already. But this is the story of the horse and his boy. And so he runs away, and as he's running away with this horse, on the back of this horse, he can hear a lion, and he can hear it growling, and he can hear it, biting at the horse's ankles, and it really scares him, and it makes the horse run faster and faster. And then when they're exhausted, they sit in the darkness, and this is what happens. Here we go. The boy and his horse have suffered a series of terrible misfortunes. Relieved that he's not about to be a giant sufferer, but nevertheless scared, lost and alone, the boy begins to cry. The stranger reassures Shasta and listens to him as he recounts his trouble, how he has been howled at in the desert, chased by lions, forced to swim for his life, how hungry, tired and thirsty and on the verge of reaching safety, another lion attacked him and wounded his travelling companion. Finally, the listening stranger speaks and reveals his identity. I was the lion. Shasta's jaw drops. I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you as you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile so they should reach King Lune in time. I was the lion you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that it came to shore where a man sat wakeful at midnight to receive you. You think, wow, it's an incredible story, isn't it? That somehow God was working through the good moments and the terrible moments to preserve the life of this young boy. This is kind of talking about the kind of enigma, the mystery of the providence and sovereignty of God. And here, God is kind of doing the same with Jacob. You know, I was the God who wrestled with you in the middle of the night. I was the God that wounded your hip. I was the God that appeared to you when you were running from your brother. I was the God who blessed you. I was the God who orchestrated the circumstances of your life. And it's like C.S. Lewis says in another book called The Problem of Pain, that God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he shouts to us in our suffering. Suffering is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world or a sleeping world. And I wonder if we could take that, you know, when good things happen to us, we want to celebrate. And sometimes when we're feeling benevolent, we thank God for the good times. But God is also often orchestrating the events, even the dark times of our lives, to bring us close to him. Now, if you look at the first video in my FAQ series, I try to wrestle a little bit with the coronavirus, and I say there that we're not saying that God is deliberately making the coronavirus in order to kill off a certain percentage of the population. That's not how God works. But it is possible that God is using or redeeming or turning something bad, he can still use it for some good purposes in our lives. And I think that's what we're learning from the crippling of Jacob. Not everybody who has a disability or walks with a limp has a specific curse from God. That's not what we're saying. But even though those things happen to us, God can still use them for good purposes. And that seems to be what happens to Jacob. That's a tough thing to hear, isn't it? But is it possible in this circumstance where we've all got a little bit more fear and anxiety in our lives, when we're worried about our loved ones and our families, there's an opportunity here for us to draw close to God, for us to call out to him, for us to realise that our only hope, our only security, our only chance is to put our hope and confidence in him. And I wonder whether from the Jacob story you could learn that you can find God and find faith in the wilderness, in the wrestling, and even in the wounding. I'd love to take questions about that. Maybe I haven't been clear, maybe the story wasn't that helpful. But my aim here is to try to wrestle with these difficult passages in the Bible of people that are facing similar circumstances to the ones that we're experiencing right now, and see if they can be a means to draw us into closer relationship with God. I haven't got all the answers. This isn't my specialised field. I'm just an ordinary Christian trying to figure this stuff out. And if you've got some insight or some wisdom or some questions, I'd love to hear them from you. We've been working things out as a family. Many of my kids are now off school. It's a different life situation. And, I spoke to some of my neighbours today. I went round trying to fill up all the missing spaces on our neighbourhood WhatsApp group, because we're trying to stay in touch with one another in case somebody has to self-isolate. And one of my neighbours has actually been in isolation for a couple of years because of personal illness. So I was trying to pick his brains about some tips, what kind of things could I be doing differently? And he had some good advice for me about, trying to keep a rhythm, not just kind of letting all the timetable go out the window, structuring your day, balance between work and leisure. All of that was really helpful. Maybe there are insights that you have that you could share as well, and I'll try and weave them into our kind of discussions together. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful. Love to hear from you. Please drop me a line. All of the other videos are available on my YouTube channel. Just search for Krish Kandiah FAQ. I think we're up to episode 5 today, and there's some others. And if you've got suggestions for what else we should be looking at, I'd love to hear from you. But I hope that was helpful. Talk to you again soon. Thanks.